get started. Sorry I'm running late. I was trying to print out some notes for this. Couldn't get it to work, so I'll be looking at my phone the whole time. I think I promised last week, so we looked at some fairy tales, or an Aesop fable and one of Grimm's fairy tales. This week we're jumping forward quite a ways in history and thinking about something maybe a little bit closer to home, depending on your definition. And that is stories about George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. So, what is the one story that you know about George Washington's childhood? Chopping down a cherry tree? I don't know. Originally in my head, I had thought I would have people like rehearse the story, like who was brave enough to tell a story. I'll offer that. I'll. Would anyone like to tell the story of George Washington chopping down the cherry tree? Thanks, Ty. I'll read it for everyone. Okay. Again, this is well. I'll go ahead and say this story. When I was studying about this, I saw the name. I've long forgotten it. But this is a made-up story. We know that this is made up about Washington. The Lincoln stories that we'll tell are at least based in truth. These are real things that happened, but then as they became stories, they got polished along the way. So, anyways, here's our Washington story. When George Washington was a small boy, his father gave him a hatchet, a prized possession and a mark of growing responsibility. Like many boys with a new tool, young George was eager to use it. One day, while playing in the family garden, he struck at a young cherry tree belonging to his father and badly damaged it. Not long afterward, his father came into the garden and noticed the tree, which had been a particular favorite. Angry and upset, he demanded to know who had ruined it. George was frightened. He knew he had done something wrong and that punishment was likely. But after a moment, he spoke plainly. I cannot tell a lie. I did it with my hatchet. Rather than punishing his son, Washington's father embraced him. He declared that George's honesty was worth more than 1,000 trees. Okay. Is this basically the version of the story you've heard? Great story. I will say, I imagine as a parent to come home and see your child standing there with a hatchet and red on the end, I cannot tell a lie. Well, more of an image of like a sociopath, but I assume it's supposed to be charming. Okay, what's the point of this story? What are we supposed to get from this? Why is this a story that would have been told?
My first thought was like an extension of grace was shown.
Okay.
I think a lot of people, that's a good feeling whenever a story ends. Oh wow, there should have been a consequence, and I wasn't.
Yeah, he done something wrong, but there's no consequence at the end. And why is that? Grace from his father is a big part of it. What else do we get from this story? Washington cutting down the cherry tree. Shows father's love. Yeah, it's tied up, and so we're getting some virtues for the father. What are the virtues of Washington, of George? Okay. Yes. Sure. Yeah, fear of punishment. She's worried about what happens, which is really maybe just a way of saying that he's a reasonable person. But then the attribute that is praiseworthy, my assumption, the reason that we would have a story like this, and why they would want to ascribe it to the father of the nation, is because of his moral uprightness, his honesty in particular. Does that seem mostly right to us?
I feel like I know there's mentioned honesty. I feel like that is kind of, it's not just honesty for the sake of honesty. It's honesty in like being fearful and then overcoming that fear and still telling the truth. Because I think there's like something to that too, when you know that like telling the truth is the ultimate good. Yeah, like he could have got like a short term benefit by telling a lie,
Hmm.
but he kind of risked punishment or consequence by telling the truth. I don't know.
I do like that line in here. It's talking about he's frightened. He knows he's done something wrong, but after a moment, he spoke plainly. There's just sort of this pushing aside any trepidation that he has in his mind and focusing, okay, this is clearly what I have to do. Then he says it outright. Any other? Go ahead.
Respect for his father, and I feel like maybe the father had in his upbringing, however old the child was, he was saying
Not in this version.
that he could see the truth about his father of being benevolent, truthful himself, compassionate. And I think that gave him a little courage. That's a little courage to tell the truth.
Yes. I was just we may talk about virtue and virtue ethics later. I was teaching I was presenting for the computer science seminar at Harding on Friday, and it's at 7 o'clock, which is like I had to be on campus earlier than I'm awake most days, which is not fun. But we were talking about in classical theology, the virtues will get separated after the development of the New Testament, but in the last 2,000 years. Virtues get organized into 7 virtues, and you give them, but if it's faith, hope, and love, and then temperance, fortitude, prudence, and justice. But clearly there's a lot more virtues that we're all familiar with. The Bible certainly talks about a lot more virtues, like telling the truth. So theologians would categorize all the other virtues as like sub-virtues for the other ones. And so we talked a lot about having a magnanimous spirit and what that involves, and that's to be a person who takes pride in their work is a sub-virtue of courage. And I was just thinking, I'm wondering where truth telling is in that. Is that considered honesty? Is that a sub-virtue? Being courageous. Fortitude. Okay, sorry, that was a brief aside. I later, as we did last week, I'll open it up to let's think about biblical parallels. This is not at all what I have written down, but based on all of y'all's comments, I will. Sounds like y'all's minds are going to go immediately toward the prodigal son, based on all of y'all's thoughts on the father. Okay, let's move on to our second story. So this one, I feel like I heard this story far less frequently than I heard just the phrase Washington cutting down the cherry tree. You hear about Honest Abe. That's a term that that name we hear a lot. But the actual stories of his honesty, is anyone, just out of interest, anyone familiar with stories about Abraham Lincoln's honesty? Okay, let me know if these, I'm going to, not my history book. Let me read, this is actually shorter than the other one, but contains 2 micro stories. And y'all tell me if these sound familiar afterward. So, as a young man, Abraham Lincoln worked as a clerk and later as a partner in a small general store in New Salem, Illinois. One evening, after closing the store, Lincoln reviewed the day's accounts and discovered that he had accidentally overcharged a customer by 2.5 cents. Adjusting for inflation, in the ballpark of around $2. Lincoln was troubled, so that same night, he walked 3 miles to the customer's house, knocked on the door, and returned the money with an apology. On another occasion, while opening the store one morning, he was inspecting his scale he used for weighing out goods. To his surprise, he found a hitch in the scale. He recalled that the day before he had sold a customer a pound of tea, and he reckoned the fault in the scale shorted the customer no more than 4 ounces. He closed the store that instant, foregoing any business for the rest of the day, as he fixed the scale and delivered the rest of the tea. Have we heard anything like these? I feel like I had heard that first one, and returning change. I feel like when I heard it as a child, the story was exaggerated a little bit. He had ford some rivers to bring the change to the person. But these are at least supposed to be rooted in actual things that Lincoln did when he owned, when he was a clerk and owned or partner for a store in Illinois. And things that earned him the name Honest Abe before he was ever running for president. Okay. What are we getting from these accounts of our, I don't know what number, 16th president? Well, you're a history guy. What do we get from these stories?
A new concept, right and wrong.
So a clear moral vision. Yeah. What else?
Yeah, I think just a radical honesty. I think it's easy for people to be truthful and maybe the words that you choose to say, but whenever you discover something that was done like the day before and it was that small of an amount, I feel like a lot of I would probably be like, kind of really upset with, you know.
Yeah. What do we assume the people that there's two customers that he shorted in those two stories? What do you think they felt about this? Presumably, if they found out, oh, I was shorted 2.5 cents, I was shorted a few ounces of tea, their first thought was like, oh, that's obnoxious. Their second thought is, okay, I'll be fine. And you have Lincoln knocking on your door in the middle of the night, like, hey, Ram, what are you doing? You didn't have to do this. Appreciate it. And I think that idea goes back to this point of it's not about doing right by these other people's accounts, remedying a problem for them. It's about he thinks that there's something that ought to be done, and I'm going to do it. Other things that you're noticing from these stories? What are some similarities between this story and the Washington story? Yes. How would you compare their convictions to be right to your own? You're putting you on the spot.
I don't know if it's appropriate to give a personal example, but the other day my mom went to a restaurant and we ordered like the same thing,
Mm-hmm.
but she had forgotten to put my hash browns to add them onto my ticket. And I knew my mom said that she was planning on it, but mine's cheaper now. I didn't get my hash browns. And I was like, hey, you do it. Maybe she'll be nice and not put the hash browns on my ticket because I was honest. No, she put the hash browns on. It's just like, you have to kind of think like, or if you actually walk out of the grocery store or something and the bottom of your cart is like, it's ham and whatever.
Yeah.
It's not that much. Like, oh, Walmart probably you can like.
Walmart's doing pretty well for itself.
Yeah, like it'll be fine, but it'll get my dollars in it. But you kind of have to decide like, it's always worth being honest, even whenever it might benefit you not to be, even in a tiny amount, or if it's just inconvenient or whatever.
Yeah, I think you're highlighting an interesting parallel in both of these stories. Well, it's more so for the Washington story, but I think you can kind of see it in the Lincoln stories. Is the lack of consequences, that everything is just sort of resolved by the end of the story through their honesty. Their honesty sort of washes over a multitude of sins and a multitude of just other consequences and problems that could have happened. This is a example that's not helpful for anyone, but I'm going to make it anyway. I remember growing up watching the cartoon Recess. Great show. There's an episode where the children in the show find a briefcase full of money, and the whole episode is about them trying to think what they could do with all of this money that they found. The recurring joke in the episode is that whatever they suggest individual to each character, they always end with, oh, and also I would buy a jetpack with the money. But at the end of the episode, they decide they need to return the briefcase of money. They try to track down who it belonged to, and they return it. But then the person like gives them, he doesn't give them all the money, but he gives them like a reward, and it's a rich man who happens to have a jetpack, and that's how the episode ends. It's fun. I saw that when I was very young, and it obviously made some sort of impact on me. To where one, I've wanted a jetpack my entire life, but two, I there's comes this assumption that doing the right thing will often lead to you benefit from that. And there's this idea. I've certainly been in that situation where it's like, I'll tell them that they forgot to charge me for this, and they'll be so grateful that they just won't charge me for it, and that never happens. So there seems to be a little bit of incongruity there. Is there anything else that you'll notice from these stories or similarities that you're picking up on?
Is honest, like at risk of consequence, I guess.
Mhm.
But Abraham Lincoln like inflicts consequence upon himself in order to be honest.
Yes, there's.
Like, he misses out on a day for the business.
Yeah, so that gives.
Or whatever
Okay, I'm curious. Do you think is one of those worse than, or sorry, yeah, is one of those better than the other? One is I'm willing to take a consequence upon me by being honest, and the other one is sort of deliberately taking a consequence upon yourself. Does that make sense?
Abraham is better stoned than
Yes.
ideal because put myself in Washington.
Sure.
I'm standing there with an axe, and my dad says, "Hey, what happened to my tree? What am I gonna say, right?"
Yeah,
I'm faced with the dilemma of he knows what happened,
yeah.
and I am not going to say otherwise. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
What, gonna make up something? Now he makes him a liar.
Yeah.
It's not like I can just trick him. If he come in the house, it's like, what happened to my tree? I'd be like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Then you can trick him,
Mm-hmm.
or you can play like
Yeah.
doing something when nobody else sees it, and it's the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And that's so way
I had forgotten a central part of that story is he's holding the hatchet. Yeah, I think that there's certainly a level of bravery for like a version of the Washington story, but I imagine most of us are a little bit more inspired by Lincoln's stories or take that on himself. It is worth noting before we move on that there's a reason that both of these one of them was less popular if we were less familiar with it. There's a reason that both of these stories are at least theoretically propagated. Why we talk about them and they have become part of our culture, and that's because they give us a moral hero. They're suggesting that the people who are central in having led the nation, making the nation what it is, had some sort of moral virtue. So that's really important. But also, it suggests, and these are people that you ought to want to be like. You should look up to them as someone who they did something that was difficult. Now, one as a small child, and so it's a little bit more mild. The other one as an adult, willing to walk 3 miles in the middle of the night, willing to give up their business. And that's something that, maybe we are supposed to aspire to. That's why these are central stories. Okay. Moving on from Washington and Lincoln. We had some central themes. The main theme that I wanted us to focus on is the honesty of both of these characters. What are biblical stories that you think bring out these same themes? What can you think of? And I've already taken, I guess there's some honesty in the prodigal son. Having to admit you're wrong. I guess there's some honesty there. Cain and Abel? Can you elaborate? Oh, yes. Yeah. And then God calls Cain out for it. Oh, your brother's blood is crying out from the ground. What a wild line. Chapter 3. Okay. What else?
I was thinking like I automatically thought of like 4 or 5 stories in scripture of dishonesty with people at work, but it's hard to think of honesty.
I want us to try to think of stories about honesty, but what are some of the dishonest stories? One or two.
Peter denies Christ.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's Abraham lying about Sarah.
Okay.
There was another one that came to my mind.
Abraham has a lot of failing upward stories.
I initially thought of, especially with Abraham, where Jesus is saying that if you have a wrong or something with your brother, you don't do it.
Yeah, that is really good. Yeah, so honesty is less central, but this idea of foregoing your own goods to do something that's more necessary, that's better. That's good. I didn't have this written down, but I'm realizing there is quite a bit of overlap between the Washington story and the story of Achan that we talked about last week, where he's done something wrong. He's confronted with that. I can't remember from what we read if it's just said, Achan, you did this, and he's like, oh yeah, I did, or if it's Achan, what did you do? In either case, he admits and says, hey, the loot is buried back in my tent. And then what happens in that story? Joshua does not embrace Achan and say, I'm so glad that you told me. He said, thanks for telling me, and now we're going to stone you and everyone in your family, and then burn you, and then stone you again. Yes. So again, sort of maintaining their principles, standing up for what they know is right. And then there is a consequence, but unlike with Achan, and it's kind of because it's the reverse of that story. The ultimate consequence is that they are saved. They are preserved. Other thoughts? Mm-hmm.
Where when you're expecting honestly a little, and overdoing a lot.
Yeah.
And I think with Lincoln, there was definitely, most people probably had the reaction when he got that back. Not so much that, oh wow, you got that small amount of money, but now
yes. Yeah. That is, yeah, I gave maybe a little bit more of a dismissive reading of what the customer's response would have been. So I think that's worth pointing out, that even if they don't care about the 2.5 cents, they care about, oh, this is the person that I probably do most of my dealings with in this small town, and now I know this is a trustworthy person. I'm glad that y'all can come up with a lot of stories that were directly about honesty, because I struggled myself, but I think that's noteworthy that in scripture we get a lot of verses, just like little passages that say to be honest or talk about the importance of the truth. So you have a lot of those, and then there's a lot of stories about dishonesty. There's a lot of that in scripture. I had also written down Abraham and Sarah, Ananias and Sapphira is a really good example as well. But there's not many stories about someone being honest and then that working out for them. There's really just not a lot of stories that's emphasizing someone's honesty in the midst of like a difficult situation at all, whether or not it works out for them. I had written down maybe that we would spend some time with Jeremiah and the false prophets. In both chapter 7, which is the temple sermon, are we familiar with the temple sermon? And then chapter 23 comes back up again, where Jeremiah is calling out these prophets, these religious leaders in Israel, Judea, for telling lies to the people, that they are suggesting that because we have the temple, because we are God's chosen people, we will be secure. We're going to be safe despite these oppressive powers that are going to attack us. And Jeremiah says, no, because the people are actually sinful, it doesn't matter that we're the chosen people. It doesn't matter that we have the temple. So he it's less about he has the choice to tell a lie or not, in kind of the situation that we see with Lincoln or Washington. It's more there's people who are deceiving themselves or deceiving those around them, and he's simply saying what he knows to be the truth. So it's a slightly different version of the situations that we've been looking at. And then what happens to Jeremiah? At least in general, he leads a pretty difficult life. He gets run out of town for what he says. Okay. Does that seem different than the other stories that we've been looking at? A lot of the stories that we see in Scripture, if there is this element of honesty, I think Jeremiah is a good example of this. It seems like people are persecuted for this. Probably an even better example, or sort of a ratcheted up example of what we see with Jeremiah, is Jesus. That's how we can think of Jesus as Jesus is simply giving the truth to the people of his time. He comes and he says, this is what you have been told, but I tell you. And telling them the truth of the gospel, which is himself. And what is the consequence of that? Yeah, a lot of people accept him, and eventually even more people accept him. But at the time, consequence seems pretty dire. He's persecuted, run out of town a few times, and eventually he's crucified, rejected. We already brought up Peter, rejected by those closest to him. Okay. How does this compare to our other stories? What does this suggest to us? That's really what last week I think we saw mostly parallels and agreement between our fairy tales and fables and the biblical stories. It seems like there's a little bit of contrast here. What's the contrast?
I don't know where you are going, but this is where my thoughts are
Please.
right now. Is this idea of like honesty. Honesty is a Christian virtue, but it's definitely not something that is in the world. I don't know if the world or our flesh has an inclination or a desire to be honest. And the stories where honesty helps you escape a consequence, or you are honest and then grace is bestowed, or something good happens because of it. I wonder if those truly are quote unquote fairy tales or like true, because it seems like the time in Scripture when people are telling the truth or honest, there's like a very significant consequence, like an earthly consequence to that.
Mm-hmm.
It has to do with knowledge and conscience. You have to have knowledge of something before you make a decision whether it's sin or not. And so I think that would be to me, like a child has no knowledge yet. It's the way you're taught from the day you're born, how you present yourself to that child and their effort. And I feel some don't work out, of course, but overall, I think good parents make good children. there's a conscience there, whether they use that conscience or not, but they have that knowledge. And I think everybody deserves to know that knowledge. In the world today, there's so much sin that I don't think children grow up with a conscience between right and wrong. Because they see that wrong so prominent in their lives. And I think it takes a very dedicated parent to try to instill in that child right and wrong and morality. Because like I said, everybody's got free will, and they make that choice ultimately whether they want to follow or not. Hopefully, if Christ hopes that they'll do the right thing to do. I feel like there's probably a lot of build up in your life, thoughts, consciousness of what you've learned, and maybe you should constantly learn this from sin and other people. It makes you want to not sin.
So there's definitely an element here of like our upbringing and how that shapes our moral compass going forward. Also regarding the difficulty of as parents raising children. Hi, Natty. Sure, y'all are doing great. Go ahead.
Those first two stories, we learn those in school when we're young. Because we're learning that honesty is a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
And telling the truth results in a positive outcome. And so, kind of, you're teaching those kids those principles. If we just started out in first grade and said, hey, you tell the truth, so he's going to run you out of town and know you're going to call.
Yeah.
They probably would be less likely to tell the truth or not, So I think that's a different level of maturity. They learn these honesty stories at a young age. When they get older, you start saying, now, to tell the truth, you're going to have to be all in.
So it seems like there's like a level of maturity here to accept. It might be the case that in most situations, honesty actually does work out pretty well for you. If you're lying all the time, your life is actually more difficult because no one trusts you in anything that you do. And so for matters of 2.5 cents, maybe the walking 3 miles immediately at night, like that is sort of above and beyond, but simply being honest about it. So maybe the next time, probably what a normal person might do is the next time you see that customer, oh, hey, I owe you 2.5 cents. Yeah. I think Lincoln's just not that smart. But then there's this level of maturity. It's like, but in some situations, well, it might actually be a little bit more difficult, to be honest. Let's add another wrinkle, maybe what might be lessons that require even more maturity. There are stories, not only is it difficult to find stories that match up with the Washington and Lincoln stories, as we've discussed, there also seem to be stories that directly contradict these stories in the Bible. Can anyone read my mind and know where I'm going with this? So I was thinking about stories about, go ahead. Yes, Rahab, and then Tamar as well as another one. Yeah, Tamar. Rahab in particular, hers is a story about lying to people and then being blessed because of that. Okay, is it just another level of maturity that, okay, and sometimes it's good to lie? How do we square that story with I think we're in agreement that the Washington Lincoln stories, those are nice stories to be able to tell our children. We think those are valuable. How can that be the case? And then also, we think the Rahab story is a story worth including in our Bibles.
My initial thought was that there's this like ultimate pursuit of maybe like what a lot of people say capital T truth, there's like ultimate truth out there.
Mm-hmm.
But then my next thought was like, I think there's a lot to say with God like working in like working in our messes, or like working with the brokenness that we have, and even though like if she would have chose not to lie there, I think I don't know, maybe that would have been good for her because she ultimately told the truth, but then like God would have still potentially true, but like, there's something about in that story that God was providentially working through it all,
Sure.
even in the messy part of her mind. I don't know if I explained that well, but
Yeah. Well, are you wanting to push toward this is just exceptional? Is that
Everything that Johnson was being able to not doing the right thing.
Or thinking that,
yeah,
maybe a different.
Okay.
I don't know where I just have thoughts.
I like it. Thoughts are good.
I think the bigger principle here is integrity.
Okay.
That is, it was integrity that made Abraham Lincoln go, that night. He could have been honest at a different time, but that made him go right away.
Mhm.
That sort of, and I think that integrity is a thing that allows for some room to figure out what the right thing to do in the situation is, in a way that maybe just honest doesn't.
So yeah, honesty is more of just like a simplified. It doesn't have all of the moral thickness that something like integrity has. I like that.
Knowledge, I think.
All comes back to knowledge for you. Keep
Yeah.
going.
Well, it fills your consciousness
Mhm.
and your inner feeling of being honest. Because in your heart, it makes you feel better. That's the lack for a better explanation. Lincoln felt better in his own heart and soul and conscience. Whether the person that received it still made sense.
Yeah.
You have to have your own conscience to live with yourself.
Mhm.
And I think everybody needs to learn that.
Yeah. So even if this wasn't the most shrewd thing to do in that moment, this is what I need to do.
Yeah, he needed that.
Yeah.
It's like,
Other thoughts before we wrap up? Basically, out of time. Make a couple of quick comments. Hopefully. First thing is, I said earlier, we were talking maybe more about virtue. This might be something that we come back to in later weeks. If you've ever studied ethics, one of the very first things that you do is you learn about these different ethical theories, ways of thinking about ethics. And one popular way of thinking about ethics, its fancy name is deontology, sometimes associated with Immanuel Kant, if you've heard that name. And Kant is really big on there are certain ways of acting that are in and of themselves good and right, and you should always do them. So he would say you should always tell the truth. There are other ways of thinking that are often called like virtue ethics, and they're going to focus on you have to be a person of integrity. You develop in yourself a number of different virtues. And those virtues help you navigate difficult situations. And they may not always look the same. Generally, it may look like just telling the truth. In most situations, there might be situations, as with Rahab, as with Tamar, where there are other goods that are more valuable that, okay, I generally want to tell the truth, but in this situation, it looks like truth is not the way to go. The quintessential example is you're hiding Jews in your house when the Nazis come knocking at your door. Do you tell them the truth? Well, if you're Corrie ten Boom's sister in the hiding place, you do. But for everyone else, we say, no, you don't tell the truth in this situation. You lie, the Nazis go, you save people's lives. Okay. Building on that, one way of reading the story, though I was struck by a few of the things that y'all said that made me rethink if this is the end-all be-all answer for what we've just been discussing. But one way I think you can understand these stories, the Washington and Lincoln stories, the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Jeremiah and Jesus stories, and then sort of in the middle of the spectrum, and then at the far end of the spectrum, stories like Rahab and Tamar, is that while the need to be honest is clear, and this is a dominant theme in Scripture, And that alone is enough to challenge most of us. That we just, if we can just be more honest, like Washington, Lincoln, we're already progressing. We're doing better than we would otherwise. But in Scripture, more often than not, individuals seem to be held up by their willingness. They're lifted up in Scripture for their willingness to bend the rules in pursuit of justice. But that is the higher good. That's what's going on with Tamar. That's what's going on with Rahab. That they choose to, okay, to sacrifice in some elements of what they would normally think of as the good because it's helping them get toward what they know is a greater good. Tamar's story, I think, is a really good example of this. That's all I have. This was a good discussion. Next week, we are talking about, I think we might actually look at some movies next week. So anyways, we'll get there when we get there.